The radio crackled to life in the Marine base tower at 0300 hours. "Control, this is Night Widow requesting permission to land." The voice was calm, professional, and unmistakably female. The young Marine corporal on duty nearly choked on his coffee. In 12 months of overnight shifts, he had never heard a woman's voice requesting landing clearance for a military aircraft in the dead of night. Night Widow, please repeat call sign and aircraft type," he stammered, looking around the empty control room as if someone might materialize to help him. "Night Widow, flying Apache AH-64. Request immediate landing clearance. I have wounded on board." The corporal's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the authorization manual. He had no idea he was about to witness history in the making, or that the pilot circling overhead would soon become one of the most decorated combat aviators in military history. All he knew was that somewhere in the darkness above, a woman was flying a gunship that most men could barely handle, and she was asking permission to save lives. What the Marines on that base didn't know was that they were about to meet someone who would redefine everything they thought they knew about courage, skill, and what it meant to be a warrior. Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls in her small Texas town. While her classmates played with dolls and dreamed of becoming teachers or nurses, she built model airplanes and spent hours watching fighter jets streak across the desert sky from the nearby Air Force Base. Her father, a Vietnam veteran who worked as a mechanic at the local airport, would find her sitting on the roof of their garage at dawn, tracking aircraft with a pair of old binoculars he had given her for her 8th birthday. "That girl's got aviation fuel running through her veins instead of blood," her mother would joke to the neighbors, though there was concern in her voice. In 1995, when Sarah graduated high school, the idea of women in combat roles was still largely theoretical. The military had policies, regulations, and centuries of tradition standing between ambitious young women and the cockpits of attack helicopters. But Sarah Martinez had never been one to accept limitations easily. She had grown up fixing engines with her father, outflying boys twice her size on the local dirt bike tracks, and maintaining perfect grades while working part-time jobs to help support her family. When the Army recruiter visited her high school during her senior year, she cornered him after his presentation with a determination that made him uncomfortable. "I want to fly helicopters," she announced, her dark eyes fixed on his with unwavering intensity. The recruiter, a seasoned sergeant who had given the same speech to hundreds of teenagers, cleared his throat awkwardly. "Well, miss, there are many opportunities for women in aviation support roles. Communications, maintenance, logistics." "No," Sarah interrupted firmly. "I want to fly combat helicopters. I want to pilot Apache gunships." The sergeant shifted his weight and glanced around the empty classroom as if looking for backup. "Ma'am, women aren't currently authorized for direct combat roles. It's military policy." "Policies change," Sarah replied with a slight smile that would later become famous among her fellow pilots. "And, when they do, I'll be ready." She enlisted 3 weeks after graduation, despite the tears and protests from her mother and the skeptical warnings from her father. Basic training at Fort Leonard Wood was a brutal awakening for many recruits, but Sarah thrived in the structured chaos. She could disassemble and reassemble an M16 rifle blindfolded faster than most of her male counterparts. During physical training, she consistently scored in the top 5% of her class. Her drill sergeants, initially skeptical of the quiet girl from Texas, began using her as an example of how soldiers should conduct themselves. Flight school at Fort Rucker, Alabama, was where Sarah's true abilities began to shine. The Warrant Officer Candidate School was designed to break down civilian pilots and rebuild them as military aviators. The training was intense, unforgiving, and had a dropout rate that exceeded 40%. Students were pushed to their mental and physical limits, forced to make split-second decisions while managing complex aircraft systems under extreme pressure. Sarah's first instructor, Chief Warrant Officer Mike Thompson, was a 20-year veteran who had flown countless missions in the Gulf War. He had seen dozens of promising candidates wash out during their first month of training, and he approached each new student with professional skepticism. When he saw Sarah's name on his roster, his first instinct was to request a transfer. He had never trained a female pilot, and the idea made him profoundly uncomfortable. Their first flight together was on a humid Alabama morning in a UH-60 Black Hawk. Thompson expected to spend most of the session explaining basic controls and helping his nervous student through simple hover maneuvers. Instead, he found himself working to keep up with Sarah's natural instincts and rapid learning curve. "Take us up to 100 feet and hold position over that clearing," he instructed through the intercom, pointing to a small field surrounded by pine trees. Sarah's hands moved smoothly across the controls, her feet making minute adjustments to the rudder pedals as the helicopter rose steadily into the morning air. Within minutes, she had the aircraft locked in a perfect hover, maintaining exact altitude and position despite the crosswinds that would normally challenge experienced pilots. Thompson watched her scan the instrument panel with practiced efficiency, her eyes moving in the precise pattern he had taught countless students but rarely saw mastered so quickly. "How many hours of helicopter time do you have, Martinez?" "This is my first time in a helicopter, sir," Sarah replied without taking her eyes off the instruments. Thompson stared at her profile for a long moment, noting the complete absence of tension in her shoulders and the relaxed grip she maintained on the controls. In 20 years of flight instruction, he had never seen a natural pilot like this. "Take us forward to that water tower at 60 knots, then bring us into a landing approach." What followed was 40 minutes of the most impressive first flight Thompson had ever witnessed. Sarah handled the Black Hawk as if she had been born in a cockpit, instinctively understanding the relationship between power, lift, and momentum that took most pilots months to master. When they finally touched down on the landing pad, Thompson sat in stunned silence for several seconds before reaching for his logbook. "Martinez," he said finally, "I'm going to ask you a question, and I want a straight answer. Have you ever flown anything before today?" Sarah turned to face him, her helmet slightly too large for her small frame, making her look younger than her 19 years. "I've flown crop dusters with my uncle since I was 12, sir. And I built and flew radio-controlled aircraft for most of my childhood. But never anything like this." Thompson nodded slowly, making a note in his logbook that would later become part of Sarah's permanent record. "Outstanding natural ability," he wrote. "Recommend immediate advancement to complex aircraft training." The crop dusting experience explains some of Sarah's instincts, but not her remarkable ability to multitask under pressure or her intuitive understanding of military aviation protocols. Over the following weeks, as she progressed through increasingly complex training scenarios, it became clear that Sarah Martinez possessed something that could not be taught or learned through experience alone. She could fly formations in weather conditions that grounded more experienced pilots. She could navigate using only compass headings and terrain features while simultaneously managing radio communications and monitoring multiple aircraft systems. During emergency simulation training, she consistently made the correct decisions under pressure, often finding creative solutions to problems that had stumped previous classes. Her fellow students, initially resentful of the attention she received from instructors, gradually began seeking her help with their own training challenges. Sarah never refused to assist a struggling classmate, often spending her limited free time explaining complex procedures or helping others practice difficult maneuvers in the flight simulators. Word of the exceptional female pilot began spreading through the tight-knit military aviation community. Senior instructors who had heard rumors about Sarah's abilities began finding excuses to observe her training flights. During a particularly challenging night formation exercise, she successfully led a four-ship flight of helicopters through a complex route in zero-visibility conditions, using only instrument references and radio coordination to maintain safe spacing and navigation accuracy. The exercise was observed by Colonel Patricia Hayes, one of the few women to achieve senior rank in Army aviation. After watching Sarah guide her formation through a simulated enemy air defense corridor while maintaining perfect tactical formation and communication discipline, Colonel Hayes made a decision that would change the trajectory of Sarah's military career. She recommended Sarah for immediate assignment to the Army's most challenging and prestigious aviation program, Apache AH-64 attack helicopter training. The Apache was the military's most sophisticated and lethal helicopter, equipped with advanced targeting systems, Hellfire missiles, and a 30mm chain gun capable of destroying armored vehicles from miles away. It was also exclusively assigned to combat units, and women were still officially prohibited from direct combat roles. But Colonel Hayes had spent her entire career navigating the complex politics of military gender integration, and she recognized that policies were beginning to shift. more importantly, she had never seen a pilot with Sarah's natural abilities and leadership potential. If the military was going to successfully integrate women into combat aviation roles, they would need exceptional candidates who could exceed every standard and prove their capabilities beyond any possible doubt. Sarah learned about her selection for Apache training during a formation ceremony attended by her entire flight school class. When her name was called and her assignment announced, the traditional applause was mixed with surprised murmurs and more than a few skeptical comments. Apache pilots were the elite of Army aviation, and many of her male classmates had applied unsuccessfully for the same program. After the ceremony, Thompson pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation. "Martinez, I want you to understand what you're walking into," he said seriously. "Apache training is brutal. The washout rate exceeds 60%, and they don't make allowances for anyone. You'll be the first woman in the program, which means you'll have to be twice as good as everyone else just to be considered adequate." Sarah listened carefully, her expression thoughtful but determined. "Sir, what would you do if you were in my position?" Thompson considered the question for a long moment. "I'd be scared as hell," he admitted. "But I'd also recognize the opportunity to make history. Sarah, I've been flying helicopters for most of my adult life, and I've never seen anyone with your natural abilities. If anyone can succeed in Apache training, it's you. Just remember that you're not just representing yourself anymore. You're representing every woman who dreams of flying combat aircraft." That evening, Sarah called her parents from a payphone outside the base exchange. Her mother cried when she heard about the Apache assignment, terrified by the implications of her daughter entering an even more dangerous phase of military training. Her father was quieter, asking practical questions about the aircraft and training requirements before finally saying, "Mija, your grandfather fought in World War II, and I served in Vietnam. We both believed we were fighting for a country where people could achieve anything if they worked hard enough and had the courage to try. You make us proud every day." 2 weeks later, Sarah Martinez reported to Fort Hood, Texas, for Apache AH-64 attack helicopter training. She arrived carrying a single duffel bag, her flight logbook documenting 200 hours of helicopter flight time and perfect scores on every written examination. She had no way of knowing that within 18 months, she would become the most feared and respected combat pilot in her unit, or that enemy forces would give her a nickname that would become legend among American forces, Night Widow. The Apache training facility at Fort Hood was unlike anything Sarah had experienced during flight school. The aircraft themselves were intimidating machines of war, bristling with sensors, weapons systems, and armor plating. Each helicopter cost more than $30 million and required months of intensive training before a pilot could be certified for combat operations. Sarah's first glimpse of her assigned aircraft came during an orientation tour led by Master Sergeant Rodriguez, a veteran Apache crew chief with 15 years of experience maintaining the sophisticated attack helicopters. As they walked through the hangar, Rodriguez pointed out various components and systems while discussing the aircraft's capabilities and limitations. "This bird can engage enemy armor from 8 kilometers away," he explained, patting the helicopter's stub wing loaded with Hellfire missiles. "The targeting system can track 16 different targets simultaneously, and the pilot can engage multiple threats without ever being seen by enemy forces. But it's also the most complex helicopter ever built, and it takes exceptional pilots to master all of its systems." Sarah studied the aircraft with the same intensity she had once reserved for her childhood model airplanes. Every sensor, every weapon mount, every armored panel represented a system she would need to understand and operate under combat conditions. The responsibility was overwhelming and exhilarating at the same time. Her Apache training class consisted of 12 pilots, all male, all with extensive military aviation experience. Several were combat veterans who had flown other aircraft in previous deployments. Sarah was not only the youngest member of the class, but also the only pilot without prior combat experience. The other students regarded her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism, unsure how to interact with the woman who had somehow gained access to their exclusive program. The training itself was unlike anything Sarah had previously experienced. Apache pilots were required to master not just flying skills, but complex weapons systems, advanced tactical procedures, and coordination with ground forces. They learned to operate sophisticated targeting equipment, manage multiple radio frequencies, and make split-second decisions involving life-and-death consequences for friendly forces on the ground. Sarah approached each new challenge with the same methodical determination that had carried her through flight school. She spent extra hours in the simulators, memorizing emergency procedures and practicing complex attack profiles. She studied technical manuals until she could recite system specifications from memory. She volunteered for additional training exercises and never complained about the physical and mental demands of the program. Her dedication began to earn grudging respect from her classmates and instructors. During a particularly challenging live-fire exercise, Sarah successfully engaged multiple targets while coordinating with ground forces and managing simulated battle damage to her aircraft. Her performance was flawless, demonstrating not just technical proficiency but the tactical judgment and situational awareness that separated exceptional pilots from merely competent ones. After the exercise, one of her classmates, a captain named David Park who had initially been openly skeptical of her presence in the program, approached her during the post-flight debriefing. "Martinez," he said quietly, "that was some of the finest flying I've ever seen. I owe you an apology for doubting your abilities." Sarah accepted his acknowledgement with characteristic grace, never mentioning the crude comments and practical jokes she had endured during her first weeks of training. She had learned early that responding to harassment or discrimination would only create distractions from her primary goal of becoming the best Apache pilot possible. As her training progressed, Sarah's reputation continued to grow. Instructors who had initially questioned her assignment to the program began using her performance as a standard for other students. Her ability to remain calm under extreme pressure, combined with her intuitive understanding of complex tactical situations, marked her as a pilot destined for combat leadership roles. But, even as Sarah excelled in training, the larger questions about women in combat remained unresolved. Military policies were slowly evolving, but the integration of female pilots into direct combat roles remained controversial and politically sensitive. Sarah understood that her success or failure would influence decisions affecting thousands of other women seeking military aviation careers. The pressure was enormous, but Sarah Martinez had never been intimidated by challenges that others considered impossible. She had spent her entire life proving that determination and skill could overcome prejudice and tradition. Now, as she prepared for the final phase of Apache training and eventual combat deployment, she was ready to prove it again on the most demanding stage of all, the battlefield. 6 months after completing Apache training, Sarah Martinez found herself deployed to Forward Operating Base Chapman in Afghanistan's volatile Khost province. The year was 2001, and American forces were engaged in intense combat operations against Taliban and al-Qaeda fighters who controlled much of the region's mountainous terrain. For Sarah, this deployment represented the culmination of years of training and the opportunity to prove herself in actual combat conditions. The base itself was a collection of temporary structures and defensive positions carved out of the harsh Afghan landscape. Dust covered everything, and the constant threat of rocket attacks kept everyone on edge. Sarah's unit, the 101st Aviation Regiment, operated a fleet of Apache helicopters providing close air support to ground forces conducting daily patrols and raids against enemy positions. Her arrival at the base created immediate controversy among the veteran pilots already stationed there. Many had never worked with female aviators, and the idea of a woman flying combat missions in one of the military's most dangerous operational environments challenged their preconceptions about warfare and gender roles. Captain James Mitchell, the unit's operations officer, made his feelings clear during Sarah's initial briefing. "Martinez, I'm going to be straight with you," he said, his weathered face showing the strain of months in combat. "This isn't flight school anymore. We're losing aircraft and crews on a regular basis, and I can't afford to have pilots who might hesitate or break down under pressure. I don't care what your training records say. Combat is different, and until you prove yourself out there, you'll be flying milk runs and escort missions." Sarah accepted the assignment without complaint, understanding that earning respect in a combat unit required demonstrating competence under actual fire. Her first missions were relatively routine transport escorts and reconnaissance flights over areas with minimal enemy activity. She used these opportunities to familiarize herself with the local terrain, enemy tactics, and the complex coordination required between air and ground forces. Afghanistan's mountainous landscape presented unique challenges for helicopter operations. The high altitude reduced aircraft performance, unpredictable weather patterns could ground flights with little warning, and enemy fighters often positioned themselves in caves and fortified positions that were nearly impossible to detect from the air. Sarah spent hours studying topographical maps and intelligence reports, learning to identify potential ambush sites and escape routes that could mean the difference between mission success and disaster. Her first real test came 3 weeks into the deployment during a routine patrol escort mission. She was flying alongside Captain Mitchell in a two-ship formation, providing overwatch for a convoy of ground vehicles moving through a narrow valley known for frequent ambush attacks. The mission was supposed to be routine, the kind of assignment given to new pilots to build their confidence and experience. The ambush came without warning. Hidden fighters opened fire from multiple positions along the valley walls, using rocket-propelled grenades and heavy machine guns to trap the convoy in a deadly crossfire. The lead vehicle took a direct hit and burst into flames, blocking the narrow road and preventing the other vehicles from advancing or retreating. Apache 2-1, we have troops in contact, Mitchell's voice crackled over the radio. Multiple enemy positions along the ridgeline. I'm taking fire from the eastern slope. Sarah immediately began scanning her targeting display, identifying muzzle flashes and heat signatures from enemy weapons. The situation was chaotic, with friendly forces pinned down among the burning vehicles while enemy fighters maintained devastating fire from elevated positions. Traditional attack procedures called for methodical target identification and careful coordination with ground commanders, but the intensity of enemy fire made it clear that immediate action was required to prevent a massacre. Apache 2-2 has multiple targets on the western ridge, Sarah reported, her voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. Request permission to engage. 2-2, stand by for target confirmation, Mitchell replied, his own aircraft maneuvering to avoid incoming fire. Ground commander needs to confirm friendly positions before we can. His transmission was interrupted by an explosion as another vehicle took a direct hit from an RPG. Sarah could see American soldiers scrambling for cover behind the disabled vehicles while enemy fire intensified from multiple directions. The ground commander's voice broke through the radio static, desperate and urgent. Any Apache, this is Bulldog 6. We have multiple casualties and are taking heavy fire from all sides. We need immediate close air support or we're going to lose the entire convoy. Sarah made a decision that would define her combat career. Without waiting for formal target clearance, she rolled her Apache into an aggressive attack dive, using her aircraft's sophisticated targeting system to identify and engage enemy positions with precision strikes from her 30mm chain gun. Her first burst of fire silenced a machine gun position that had been devastating the trapped convoy, and her second destroyed an RPG team preparing to fire on the rescue vehicles. 2-2, what are you doing? Mitchell's voice carried a mixture of alarm and admiration. You don't have clearance to engage. 2-1, friendly forces are dying down there, Sarah replied, continuing her attack run while dodging incoming fire from remaining enemy positions. I have clear targets and positive identification. Engaging now. What followed was a masterpiece of precision flying and tactical employment. Sarah maneuvered her Apache through the narrow valley like a deadly ballet, using the aircraft's agility and firepower to systematically eliminate enemy positions while avoiding collateral damage to friendly forces or civilian structures. She coordinated her attacks with ground forces, using radio communications to verify target locations and ensure that her strikes supported the overall tactical situation. Her accuracy was phenomenal. Each burst from her chain gun found its target, and her Hellfire missile strikes eliminated fortified positions that had withstood previous attacks. More importantly, she demonstrated an intuitive understanding of battlefield dynamics, anticipating enemy movements and positioning her aircraft to maximum advantage while minimizing exposure to defensive fire. The engagement lasted 18 minutes. When it ended, 12 enemy fighters were dead, their positions destroyed, and the convoy was able to continue its mission with minimal casualties. Sarah had expended nearly all of her ammunition and fuel, but her aircraft remained undamaged despite flying through intense defensive fire. After landing back at base, Sarah was immediately summoned to the operations tent for debriefing. She expected to face disciplinary action for engaging targets without formal clearance, but instead found herself facing a room full of senior officers who had monitored the engagement through radio communications and drone surveillance footage. "Martinez," Colonel William Hayes began, his expression serious but not hostile, "what you did out there was either brilliant tactical flying or a serious breach of engagement protocols. Help me understand your decision-making process." Sarah stood at attention, her flight suit still damp with perspiration from the intense mission. "Sir, friendly forces were under immediate threat of being overrun. The enemy fire was too intense to allow time for traditional target clearance procedures. I had positive identification of hostile forces and clear fields of fire that would not endanger friendly positions. Based on my assessment of the tactical situation, immediate engagement was required to prevent friendly casualties." The colonel studied her for a long moment before consulting the reports spread across his desk. "Ground commander reports that your actions saved at least 12 American lives and prevented the loss of critical supply vehicles. Your target engagement was 100% accurate, with no collateral damage or friendly fire incidents. The drone footage shows flying that I've never seen from a pilot with your limited combat experience." He paused, looking around the room at the other officers present. "Martinez, what you accomplished today was exceptional. But I need to know that you can consistently perform at this level under pressure, because after today, you're going to be assigned to our most dangerous missions." That night, Sarah called her parents using the base satellite phone. She couldn't provide details about her mission due to security restrictions, but she wanted to hear their voices after her first real combat experience. Her mother could sense the change in her daughter's voice, the new confidence that came from proving herself under the most demanding conditions possible. "Mija, are you okay?" her mother asked, maternal instincts detecting the underlying tension in Sarah's carefully controlled words. "I'm fine, Mom," Sarah replied, looking out at the Afghan mountains silhouetted against the star-filled sky. "I think I'm finally becoming the pilot I always wanted to be." Over the following weeks, Sarah's role in the unit transformed completely. Captain Mitchell, who had initially questioned her assignment to combat operations, became one of her strongest advocates. He began requesting her specifically for the most challenging missions, recognizing that her combination of technical skill and tactical judgment made her invaluable for complex operations requiring precision and reliability. Her fellow pilots gradually accepted her as an equal, then, as someone whose abilities exceeded their own. The crude jokes and skeptical comments disappeared, replaced by professional respect and genuine friendship. Sarah never acknowledged the change directly, but she appreciated being evaluated based on performance rather than gender or preconceptions. The missions became increasingly dangerous as enemy forces adapted their tactics to counter American air superiority. Taliban and Al-Qaeda fighters learned to use caves and underground tunnels to avoid detection, emerging only long enough to attack American positions before disappearing back into hidden sanctuaries. They also began using sophisticated anti-aircraft weapons obtained from various sources, making low-level attack runs increasingly hazardous for helicopter crews. Sarah's reputation as an exceptional pilot grew with each successful mission. She demonstrated an uncanny ability to locate hidden enemy positions, often detecting targets that other pilots missed completely. Her accuracy with both the chain gun and Hellfire missiles became legendary within the unit, and ground commanders began specifically requesting her aircraft for operations requiring surgical precision. But it was her performance during night missions that truly set Sarah apart from other pilots. Flying attack helicopters in darkness over hostile terrain required skills that few pilots possessed. The combination of limited visibility, challenging weather conditions, and sophisticated enemy tactics made night operations extremely dangerous even for experienced crews. Sarah seemed to thrive in these conditions. She developed an intuitive feel for night flying that allowed her to navigate through mountain valleys and engage targets with deadly accuracy despite the darkness. Her use of night vision equipment and infrared targeting systems became so proficient that she could detect and engage enemy positions that were invisible to other pilots flying the same routes. During one particularly challenging mission, Sarah was tasked with providing close air support for a special forces team that had been surrounded by enemy fighters in a remote mountain village. The operation required flying through narrow valleys in complete darkness, locating friendlies who were pinned down in a complex urban environment, and eliminating hostile forces without causing civilian casualties or friendly fire incidents. The mission briefing emphasized the extreme difficulty of the assignment. Previous attempts to provide air support had failed due to the challenging terrain and the enemy's sophisticated defensive positions. 2 Apache helicopters had been damaged during earlier attempts, and 1 crew had been forced to conduct an emergency landing under fire. Sarah volunteered for the mission despite the obvious dangers. "Sir," she told the operations officer, "if our people are surrounded out there, they need someone who can find them in the dark and get them out. I can do this." The flight to the target area took 45 minutes, navigating through mountain passes using only night vision equipment and infrared navigation aids. Sarah flew at extremely low altitude to avoid enemy radar, using terrain masking to conceal her approach while monitoring multiple radio frequencies for updates from the trapped Special Forces team. When she arrived over the village, the tactical situation was even more complex than the intelligence briefings had indicated. The Special Forces team was surrounded in a stone building near the center of the village, while enemy fighters occupied positions throughout the surrounding structures. Civilian families were trapped in their homes, making indiscriminate fire impossible. Sarah spent 20 minutes circling the area, using her aircraft's sophisticated sensors to map enemy positions and identify safe firing lanes that would not endanger friendly forces or civilians. She coordinated directly with the Special Forces team leader, using precise descriptions of target locations and attack angles to ensure that her strikes would support the ground tactical plan. Her first Hellfire missile eliminated a machine gun position that had been preventing the Special Forces team from moving to a better defensive position. Her second destroyed a mortar team that had been dropping rounds dangerously close to the building where American forces were trapped. Each strike was precisely placed, causing maximum damage to enemy forces while avoiding collateral damage to surrounding structures. The engagement continued for over an hour as Sarah systematically eliminated enemy positions while managing her fuel consumption and ammunition supply. She demonstrated remarkable patience and tactical discipline, refusing to take shots that might endanger civilians or friendly forces despite the urgent requests for immediate support from the ground commander. When the mission finally concluded, the Special Forces team was able to withdraw safely with no casualties. 8 enemy fighters had been eliminated, their positions destroyed, and the village remained largely undamaged. Sarah had expended all of her missiles and most of her cannon ammunition, but her aircraft had sustained no damage despite flying through intense defensive fire. After landing, she was met by Colonel Hayes and several other senior officers who had monitored the entire mission from the operations center. "Martinez," the colonel said quietly, "I've been in military aviation for 22 years, and I've never seen flying like that. You just accomplished something that experienced pilots with hundreds of combat hours couldn't do." Word of Sarah's exceptional night flying abilities spread quickly through the special operations community. Within weeks, she was receiving requests from various units for missions requiring precision air support in challenging conditions. Her call sign evolved from the standard Apache 22 to something more personal and descriptive, Night Widow. The nickname emerged from her ability to strike with deadly precision from the darkness, eliminating threats that other pilots couldn't even detect. Enemy fighters began to fear the sound of her Apache's rotors cutting through the night air, knowing that death could come from the shadows without warning. American ground forces, conversely, learned that having Night Widow overhead meant they had the finest close air support available anywhere in the combat theater. Sarah's transformation from uncertain trainee to legendary combat pilot was complete. But her greatest test still lay ahead, a mission that would require everything she had learned about flying, fighting, and leadership. The Marines who would soon request her assistance had no idea they were about to witness capabilities that would redefine their understanding of what was possible in aerial combat. The emergency call came at 0247 hours on a moonless October night in 2002. Sarah Martinez was sleeping in her small quarters at FOB Chapman when the base alarm system jolted her awake. Within minutes, she was sprinting toward the flight line, pulling on her flight gear while the duty officer briefed her on the developing crisis. "Night Widow, we have a Marine reconnaissance team pinned down approximately 40 clicks northeast of here," the officer explained, his voice tight with urgency. "They've been surrounded for 6 hours, and conventional air support can't reach them due to weather conditions and terrain. The Marines are requesting immediate extraction, but their LZ is hot and getting hotter. Sarah was fully alert now, her mind automatically processing the tactical implications. A Marine recon team meant highly trained special operations personnel who wouldn't call for help unless the situation was desperate. Weather conditions that grounded other aircraft suggested severe challenges that would test every aspect of her flying abilities. "What's the enemy strength?" she asked, conducting her pre-flight inspection with practiced efficiency. "Unknown, but significant," the officer replied, consulting his notes. "The Marines report automatic weapons, RPGs, and what sounds like crew-served weapons. They've taken casualties and are running low on ammunition. Weather forecast shows deteriorating conditions with possible sandstorms moving through the area." Sarah nodded grimly, understanding that this mission would require flying through hostile territory in dangerous weather conditions to reach Marines who were fighting for their lives against unknown enemy forces. It was exactly the kind of impossible situation that had made her reputation, but the stakes had never been higher. Her Apache helicopter sat on the flight line like a mechanical predator, its stub wings loaded with Hellfire missiles and its 30mm chain gun ready for action. Sarah completed her pre-flight inspection in record time, her hands moving with the automatic precision that came from months of combat operations. Every system had to be perfect, because there would be no second chances on this mission. The flight to the target area took 35 minutes through some of the most challenging flying conditions Sarah had ever encountered. Sandstorms were building along the mountain ridges, creating visibility conditions that made instrument flying mandatory even with night vision equipment. The terrain was exceptionally rugged, with narrow valleys and sudden elevation changes that required constant attention to avoid controlled flight into terrain. As she approached the coordinates provided by the Marines, Sarah began monitoring their radio frequency to better understand the tactical situation. What she heard made her blood run cold. The Marine team leader, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, was coordinating defensive fires while reporting their increasingly desperate circumstances to higher headquarters. Any station, this is Recon Team Bravo." Rodriguez's voice carried the controlled urgency of a professional warrior under extreme pressure. "We have 2 urgent surgical casualties and are nearly black on ammunition. Enemy forces are massing for what appears to be a final assault. We need immediate extraction or close air support, over." Sarah keyed her radio, her voice calm and professional despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Recon Team Bravo, this is Night Widow. I'm inbound to your location with a full combat load. Give me your exact position and enemy disposition." There was a brief pause before Rodriguez responded, and Sarah could hear the relief in his voice. "Night Widow, thank God. We're in a small valley approximately 2 clicks east of grid 41 SMB 12345 67890. Enemy forces have us surrounded on 3 sides, with our backs to a cliff face. We've counted at least 20 hostiles with automatic weapons, and they have at least 2 RPG teams." Sarah studied her moving map display, correlating the Marines' position with the terrain features visible through her night vision system. The tactical situation was even worse than the initial briefing had suggested. The Marines were trapped in what amounted to a natural amphitheater, with enemy forces controlling the high ground on multiple sides. Any rescue attempt would require flying directly into concentrated defensive fire from elevated positions. "Recon Team Bravo, I need you to mark your exact position with infrared strobes," Sarah instructed, beginning her approach to the target area. "I'm going to orbit at altitude to get a complete picture of the enemy positions before beginning my attack run." What she saw through her targeting system was sobering. The Marines were clustered behind a small pile of rocks in the center of the valley, while enemy fighters occupied defensive positions along the surrounding ridgelines. The enemy had positioned their forces expertly, creating interlocking fields of fire that would make any approach to the Marines extremely dangerous. But Sarah had faced similar challenges before, and she had learned that the key to success in complex tactical situations was patience, precision, and the willingness to take calculated risks when necessary. She spent several minutes studying the enemy positions, identifying priority targets and planning her attack sequence to maximize effectiveness while minimizing exposure to defensive fire. Her first Hellfire missile eliminated an RPG team positioned on the northern ridge, the explosion lighting up the valley and temporarily blinding enemy fighters using night vision equipment. Her second missile destroyed a machine gun position that had been directing fire at the Marines' defensive position. Each strike was precisely placed, demonstrating the accuracy that had made her legendary among American ground forces. But the enemy fighters were experienced and well-trained. They quickly adapted to her presence, dispersing their positions and beginning coordinated fires designed to bring down her helicopter. Sarah found herself flying through a web of tracer fire and RPG rounds, using every bit of her flying skill to avoid the deadly projectiles while continuing to engage enemy positions. "Night Widow, you're taking heavy fire," Rodriguez called over the radio. "We can see multiple muzzle flashes targeting your position." Sarah was already maneuvering aggressively, using terrain masking and sudden direction changes to avoid enemy fire while maintaining her attack on hostile positions. Her chain gun delivered devastating accurate fire, eliminating enemy fighters who exposed themselves long enough to engage her aircraft. But the tactical situation remained desperate, and she was running low on ammunition. "Recon Team Bravo, I need you to be ready for immediate extraction," Sarah announced, making a decision that would require every bit of her flying skill and tactical judgment. "I'm going to eliminate the remaining enemy positions, then land in your location to pick you up." The silence that followed her transmission spoke volumes about the apparent impossibility of what she was proposing. Landing a helicopter in a confined area under enemy fire was dangerous enough under ideal conditions. Attempting it while surrounded by hostile forces in challenging weather conditions was something that no reasonable pilot would consider. But Sarah Martinez had never been limited by what other people considered reasonable. She had spent her entire military career proving that determination and skill could overcome seemingly impossible odds, and she was not about to let Marines die while she had the capability to save them. Her final attack run was a masterpiece of tactical flying. Sarah brought her Apache down to treetop level, using terrain features to mask her approach while engaging the remaining enemy positions with devastating precision fire. She eliminated 3 more hostile positions in rapid succession, her chain gun finding targets that other pilots would never have detected. As the last enemy muzzle flash disappeared, Sarah began her approach to the small clearing where the Marines waited. The landing zone was barely large enough for her helicopter, surrounded by rocks and trees that left almost no margin for error. The deteriorating weather conditions made visibility marginal even with night vision equipment, and she had to compensate for crosswinds that threatened to push her aircraft into the surrounding obstacles. The landing itself was flawless, a testament to flying skills that had been honed through hundreds of combat missions and thousands of training hours. Sarah held her helicopter in a precise hover while the Marines loaded their wounded comrades and equipment, her eyes constantly scanning for any sign of remaining enemy activity. "Night Widow, all personnel and equipment are loaded," Rodriguez reported, his voice carrying profound gratitude and amazement. "You just did something that nobody thought was possible." The flight back to base was tense but uneventful. Sarah monitored multiple radio frequencies while flying through the continuing sandstorm, ensuring that her passengers received medical attention as quickly as possible. The 2 wounded Marines were conscious and stable, their lives saved by her willingness to attempt a rescue that conventional wisdom deemed impossible. When they finally landed at the Marine base, Sarah was surprised to find a crowd of personnel waiting on the flight line. Word of her mission had spread quickly through the special operations community, and Marines who had heard the radio transmissions wanted to see the pilot who had accomplished the impossible. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez approached her as she shut down the helicopter engines, his weathered face showing the strain of combat but also profound respect. "Ma'am, I've been a Marine for 12 years, and I've worked with a lot of aviation units. What you did tonight was the finest flying I've ever seen. You saved 8 Marines who would have died without your help." The base commander, Colonel James Patterson, arrived shortly afterward to debrief the mission and meet the pilot who had accomplished what his own aviators had considered impossible. "Captain Martinez," he said formally, "I want you to know that your actions tonight exemplify everything we expect from American military aviators. You demonstrated courage, skill, and dedication that will be remembered long after this war is over." But it was the reaction from her fellow pilots that meant the most to Sarah. When she returned to FOB Chapman 12 hours later, she found that her helicopter had been decorated with 8 small Marine Corps emblems, representing the lives she had saved. Her squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Thompson, was waiting with a bottle of champagne and the news that she was being recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross. "Sarah," he said quietly, using her first name in recognition of what she had accomplished, "what you did last night was extraordinary even by your standards. I've never seen flying like that, and I've never seen a pilot with your combination of technical skill and tactical judgment. You've redefined what's possible in combat aviation." The mission became legendary within the military aviation community. The combination of weather conditions, tactical complexity, and the successful rescue of surrounded ground forces under intense enemy fire created a case study that would be taught at military schools for years to come. Sarah's flying techniques and decision-making process were analyzed and incorporated into training programs for future combat pilots. But, perhaps more importantly, her success opened doors that had previously been closed to women in military aviation. The undeniable proof of her capabilities under the most demanding combat conditions helped accelerate the integration of female pilots into roles that had traditionally been restricted to men. Within 2 years, the military policies that had once limited women's participation in combat operations were officially eliminated. Sarah continued flying combat missions for another 8 months, accumulating over 300 combat flight hours and numerous decorations for valor and exceptional performance. Her reputation as Night Widow became part of military folklore, inspiring a new generation of female aviators who saw her success as proof that gender was irrelevant when it came to courage, skill, and dedication to mission accomplishment. When her deployment finally ended, Sarah returned to the United States as one of the most decorated helicopter pilots in military history. She was promoted to major and assigned to a training command, where she helped develop the next generation of Apache pilots. Her students, both male and female, learned from someone who had proven that excellence knew no boundaries. Years later, when military historians studied the integration of women into combat roles, they would point to Sarah Martinez as the pilot who proved that capability mattered more than gender. Her call sign, Night Widow, became synonymous with precision, courage, and the willingness to attempt the impossible when lives hung in the balance. The Marines she saved that night never forgot her sacrifice and skill. They stayed in contact with Sarah throughout their military careers, and several attended her promotion ceremonies and retirement celebration. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who went on to become a sergeant major, always introduced her the same way: "This is the pilot who taught us that angels sometimes fly Apache helicopters." Sarah's story became more than just a tale of individual achievement. It represented the